for Wayne County to order. Madam Clerk, can we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Marecki.
Here.
Commissioner Baidoon has requested an excuse. Commissioner Anderson.
Present.
Commissioner Killeen. Chair Baker McCormick.
Here.
You have a quorum present.
Next item, please.
B, Chairwoman's remarks.
So today we have a few guests in the audience. We're going to address the issue of toxic waste and landfills and the environment today. And I'm glad that you're all here, especially our guest speakers. And we will move forward with the next item.
C, approval of the April 4th, 2023 meeting minutes.
Is there a motion? It's been moved and supported. All those in favor? Vote, please.
Motion
Motion.
carried.
Thank you. Next item.
B, unfinished business. There is none listed.
Next item.
Item 1, under new business, discussion with Elizabeth Brown, Director, Materials Management Division, Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, on oversight of the Romulus Deep Well Injection Site. Additional speakers will be Nicholas J. Schreck, Associate Dean of Experiential Education and Associate Professor of Law, University of Detroit Mercy School of Law, Rhonda Anderson, Environmental Justice Organizer, Sierra Club, Michigan, and Patrick Cullen, Environmental Services Group Division Director, Wayne County Department of Public Services.
Thank you. So Ms. Brown is going to appear on Zoom.
Good afternoon. I'm here.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for appearing today via Zoom. And you can go right ahead and please just introduce yourself.
Sure, absolutely. My name's Liz Brown, and I'm the Director of the Materials Management Division within the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. And among our many programs is the Hazardous Waste Management Program. So that's why I'm here today. I also have two other people here. I don't know if I can move my laptop here, but this is Kimberly Tyson. She is the section manager for the Hazardous Waste Management Program. And then hope I'm not making you dizzy. Here to my right is Rhonda Blair, and she is the actual project lead for the Romulus facility. So there's a question I can't answer between these two women, we'll have it covered. So just
Thank you. And I hope that you can stay on for questions after your presentation. So,
Sure.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
And I understand you had a PowerPoint.
Right.
Okay.
And I can send it to you afterwards so that you can share it so that people don't have, there's a lot of text on some of them, and it's just so that the information will be available to people after the actual meeting and they can reflect back on it if they want to remind themselves. I will tell you, we use Teams, so my Zoom skills are more limited, but I think I can get us going. So let me know. Let me get started at the top. And presentation, yeah, as soon as I had to get it on the first page. Okay, so then hopefully folks can see that.
Yes.
Okay, just
Perfect.
the cover page to let you know you're in the right room if that's what you're interested in. And so talk a little bit first about just the hazardous waste program in general in terms of what we call our treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. These are the facilities that require licensure by the state of Michigan through Materials Management Division in the Hazardous Waste Program. We also regulate generators of hazardous waste, but we're not going to talk about those today because I know the main interest is in the facility in Romulus, or that was the focus that I was asked to talk about. So this first slide is just kind of setting the stage, talks about the history of the program, when it started at the federal level, and some of the basic requirements for all of our what we call TSDs or TSDFs. So I'm hopefully going to give you a description of any of the acronyms I use, but I probably will be using acronyms just to get through all this. So the TSDFs have what we call strict liability in terms of their environmental obligations, and that liability stays with the land. So if somebody was operating a treatment, storage, and disposal facility on a parcel of land where they were licensed to do that, and they decide we're not going to do that anymore, and they sell the property to someone else, that new property owner becomes responsible party for anything that happens relative to any hazardous waste that wasn't appropriately dealt with on that property. So the liability, unless there's an agreement between a previous owner and the current owner, the liability stays with the property. So then 1980 is when it started, and then in 84 there were some amendments to RCRA, is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. That's the federal level program. The amendments addressed the responsibilities for facilities under what we call corrective action. And basically that just means their responsibilities to clean up the facility should they cause any releases. And so with those added responsibilities, a lot of the TSDs in the state decided to close rather than to continue operations. And so in many respects, the hazardous waste program has been one of the very successful programs at the federal and state level, because we have seen a reduction in the number of TSDs across the state, and that the ones that are remaining are generally managed by companies that have a history with these kind of operations and have the wherewithal to deal with them. So I'm going to have to flip back and forth here a little bit. So we had these programs, and then the facilities had to first had to say, hey, I'm here, and file what we called at the federal level a Part A. And that was just saying, hey, I'm here. And then with the amendments, the EPA said, okay, if you're going to stay in operation, you have to get authorized as a hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facility. And so facilities that were in operation in 1980 got what we call grandfathered in. Now, the Reese facility was not in operation at that time, so they had to go through a full construction permit and operating license review process. So they had to come in first and say, this is who we are, this is what we want to do, and get that process approved. Then they had to do the work that was needed to construct the facility up to the standards that were approved in their permit application. And then once that was done and evaluated, they would come in for their operating license so that they could continue operations. So they are a little different than most of our other TSDs that we still have in the state, in that they weren't in operation initially. And so again, those that wanted to continue operations did what they called their Part B, and they could close. Once they were done with their operations, they could either close by what we call a clean closure, and that means they removed any waste material that was on site that they had been processing or whatever, and then also dealt with cleaning, like if they had tank storage, they cleaned out the storage areas, the concrete was cleaned, all that kind of thing. And then they also had to assure that if there was any environmental contamination, that had either there hadn't been a release or that any release had been resolved completely. So that was kind of a clean closure. And then others that had more extensive contamination where they couldn't get it clean closed have to go on, and then any landfill. So you can have someone that was a landfill from the get-go, that the waste is still there, or you can have someone that was maybe using surface impoundments and they just can't get the facility totally clean so that they're leaving waste in place. Then they have long-term ongoing obligations relative to that waste material. And so they continue to be evaluated even during their closure period. And so with that, and then one thing to talk about, you'll see on the slide here, it talks about disposal facilities that accept CERCLA waste are inspected annually. CERCLA is a shortcut we use, is basically the Superfund program, and you have to be authorized separately by US EPA. They do a review of the facility, and EPA has to authorize you to accept CERCLA or Superfund waste. So that's just an additional little thing. The state doesn't have a similar requirement as that. That was just something that was done at the federal level. So, and then I know there's been a lot of concern about why no one was notified about the Ohio waste shipments. There are no requirements at the state or federal level for advance notification for waste shipments. The generators of the waste, they make their arrangements directly with whatever TSDF they want to work with. So they provide information on the waste characteristics of the material they have and send the TSD any requirement or any information they require. The TSDF says, yes, I'm allowed through my license to accept the waste, the type of waste you have into my facility. And then they work through that. But again, as long as the TSD is authorized to accept the waste that's being generated, there aren't any specific notifications that are required. And so we talked about the waste getting to the facility. There are significant transportation program requirements. Both hazardous waste transporters and what we call liquid industrial byproduct transporters both need to be authorized through Act 138 of 1998 to transport material within Michigan. And there's insurance requirements so that if they should have an incident, that there's funding there to address any cleanup. It should be noted that this is transport via highway, via road. It doesn't apply to railroad or ship transport of waste. Those are covered at the federal level. We do have a requirement for safety records that we can review to assure that the transporters are maintaining things in the appropriate condition. And the transporter the generator provides the transporter with paperwork called a manifest, and the material can only go to the TSD that is identified by the generator. So if the generator gets to the door of the TSD and the TSD is closed because of flooding in the roads or something, they have to go back to the generator and say, hey, they're not available to accept the waste now. What do you want to do? And so it's not like they can the transporter can't decide on their own to take it someplace else just because they don't want to drive to the TSD. So, and then there's also specific reporting and response requirements if there's a problem with what they see in the waste material when it's at the TSD and what the paperwork says. So if the paperwork leads them to believe they're going to get a green solid and they end up with a blue liquid, they would say, wait a minute, this is not what we thought we were getting. This is not matching what they say it is. Take it back. And then to kind of close the loop, the TSDs do have to let the generator know once they've taken care of the waste for them, so that the generator can say, okay, that waste has been appropriately dealt with. And I talked about the manifest that's needed. It's federally required. And again, it's to track the waste from the point of generation or the cradle to the grave, either a disposal site like a landfill, or if it's something that can be treated to a non-hazardous status, like if it's got a high or low pH and they just treat it to bring the pH into an appropriate level, whatever the case may be, that full process. So it could go to a treatment facility, and then from the treatment facility to a disposal facility, and each step of that process would have to be identified through the manifest system. And the public can get access to manifests for any facility 90 days after it's been closed out, if you will. So that is available publicly. So you wanted some discussion about the Republic facility specifically. Again, we all know it's in Romulus, Michigan. It is a licensed hazardous waste storage and treatment facility, and that's what's regulated by our division, Materials Management Division. Now, a lot of people just say the Republic Deep Well. Well, there's actually two parts to that facility. So we regulate the storage and treatment part, and then US EPA and our Oil, Gas, and Minerals Division actually regulate the activities associated with the deep well. So even though they're co-located, they're totally different sets of requirements between the treatment and storage of the material and the ultimate disposal of the material. So how does the hazardous waste program, or Part 111, impact this particular facility? So again, we only address the storage and treatment, and then any generator accumulation activities that are associated with the facility. So you'll see there is a whole bunch of different things that our folks have to evaluate in the operating license for them to continue operations. So the waste analysis plan, that's what they use. I said the generator sends them information about what they're sending. When it gets to the TSD has to do a look at that material and maybe even do some additional testing to show that, okay, I know what they said they sent me, they actually sent me, so that we don't have issues with that. They have inspections they have to do. Obviously, they have to have specialized training for their personnel. They have to have a contingency plan should something happen, and they need to work with the local emergency folks to assure that they're comfortable with the contingency plan and are aware of what's going on at the facility and where things are located, things like that. They have to have a closure plan. What are you going to do with the site when you're done whatever processes you have? One of the things for this facility, the neighborhood was very concerned about truck traffic. And so it was determined that there was only one route that the truck should take. And I know there was work that had to be done with the railroad, and they had to move some power lines to enable that to happen. But that is something that we work out quite frequently with our waste facilities, is to assure that, you know, sometimes I don't want the trucks going through when schools are coming and going, school children, things like that. So the license again identifies what waste they can accept. Just because your license is a hazardous waste treatment, storage, or disposal facility does not mean you can take any hazardous waste you want. They have to identify what they're interested in handling, and then we have to review that. If we accept it, we put it into the license. And then they have containers and tanks, container and tank storage, so that has to be evaluated, what treatment processes they're using. There's environmental monitoring. I'll go a little more into that. The corrective action we talked about, that's if they do have a release outside of the facility that needs to be addressed, they have to assure that that's done. And then they have some air emission requirements, specialized air emission requirements because of the activities that they do. So again, you know, those are the things that are in the license. We also do at least 4 inspections at each of our TSDFs every year, and they're handled by our district offices. So it's one of our inspectors out of Warren that conducts those inspections for this facility, and you can see the kinds of things that they look at, and most of them you'll see will reflect back to the list of things that are in their license. So we want to make sure that what they said they were going to do, what we approved for them to do, is what they're actually doing. And so you'll see that. And we are authorized, even though the parent program is a federal program under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, we are authorized to manage the hazardous waste program within Michigan. So we are the prime inspectors, managers of these sites, but EPA does have an oversight role, and they could, if they felt we weren't doing the program appropriately, step in and do it on behalf of the citizens. So that has never been an issue with us, but that is something they could do if they felt it was warranted. So they do have environmental monitoring programs at this facility. I know that's something, folks are concerned about, and rightfully so. So they have to do groundwater monitoring. They have an ambient air monitoring program, but according to our air quality folks, they've never had to put it in place because it only kicks in if there's a exceedance in a certain concentration of a chemical, and they've never accepted that waste at the site. They also do soil monitoring, and then they have a surface water monitoring program because they have stormwater that will generate on the site, and it has to be disposed of. And so that's through our surface water folks. And then they did get a permit to install initially from air quality. And then this is just because there was so much interest about this site after the Ohio soil or fluids came here. We have put in place another comment period. So folks can the information's here, it runs through midnight on May 3rd. And folks can either email or write a letter to us with any concerns they have. We will note that we understand sometimes public sentiment is not in favor of having these facilities where they're located, but by law, that is not something that we can take into account in our review. They have to be technical comments that show a shortcoming in the facility somehow relative to the requirements in Part 111. So, and I know that's very confusing and upsetting to the public, but that is where our statutory ability lies. And then again, the injection wells are not permitted by us. They're permitted by US EPA. And then there is some oversight by our Oil, Gas, and Minerals Division. And that's it for our presentation.
Thank you. Thank you again, Ms. Brown, for your presentation. One of the things you mentioned about the transporter, do you coordinate with the local municipalities like Wayne County if there's a transporter of certain types of chemicals? Is there any requirement in that?
No, we don't get any notification to share with anyone else. It's my understanding, because of the concerns that came up at with the shipment of materials from the Ohio incident. And this is my understanding. I don't want to speak for US EPA, but it's my understanding that US EPA indicated that they would give us notice if these kind of circular wastes are coming, because they would have information about that if they were coming into Michigan. And then we could, of course, let the local folks know as well.
Thank you. Commissioners. Vice Chair, Commissioner Killeen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for joining us today, Ms. Brown.
Absolutely.
My my aim here is just to get the facts out onto the ground, not to hang anybody for any decisions that were made. You've gone into a little bit of the complexities of the law on this. So let me ask you a few follow-up questions. Even if there was notification, if the EPA was kind enough to notify you and you could notify the local folks, does that change anything in terms of anything going into the ground?
Not if it's legally authorized to do so, right? In this instance, both the material that went to Wayne Disposal and the material that went to Romulus, those were totally within the list of materials that they could manage and within the concentration levels that they were allowed to accept.
This goes on all over the country. Everybody
Yes.
gets this. Okay. So you referred to the Materials Management Division. That's of Eagle.
Yes.
And excuse me, you might have to correct me a couple of times here if I happen to say the old name for the department up there.
That's okay. We do it too.
Yeah, I bet you do after all those years. The monitoring that goes on at these sites, is that self-monitoring and they report, or is this state folks going out and collecting the data?
It's monitoring that they do and report, but we can and sometimes do what we call, well, we do our own checks. We will go out when they're sampling and watch what they're doing and take our own samples back to our own state lab. So we want to be there when they're doing the sampling, because how you do the sampling is very impactful in terms of the results you get. So we want to make sure that they're using the right procedures and practices during the sampling event. And then we have our own lab where we will do our own independent evaluations of
That's
the.
something you do on a routine basis, because as you say, where and how you sample can have, I can go out to a facility and sample in 3 or 4 different places at that facility and get 3 or 4 different results.
Yeah, for groundwater sampling, things don't change that often. You know, they are. Oh, here, Rhonda's going to fill in. She's
I'm
the project
sorry.
manager.
Disembodied voice. Under the groundwater monitoring program.
I'm sorry, can you state your full name and title, please? For the record.
Rhonda Blair, it's spelled a little differently. It's Blayer, and I'm an environmental engineering specialist with this division. And I am the project lead for the hazardous waste license for the Romulus facility.
Thank you.
And in terms of the question regarding if you sample in different locations, logic says you may get different answers. The plans in place, regardless of the media being sampled, dictate where those samples are to be collected. For example, groundwater, there are dedicated wells that are sampled on a specified frequency for specified parameters. So you have the ability to evaluate those sampling efforts over time and compare them, because they are being taken at the same locations. The same thing would be.
I'm sorry, I don't want to get into too much of that here.
Yeah.
So when a facility is permitted, where you cite the sampling is designated.
Correct.
And the state has a thing to say about that.
Yes.
Correct.
And then from then on, they do it. And so the state doesn't routinely do its own sampling unless they think there's something wrong with the sampling that they're getting.
Right. When we get the reports, if we see information from the lab that suggests maybe there was a lab error or any other thing that doesn't add up, the licenses have a protocol in place for resampling, And if there is resampling, we will be out there splitting samples with them.
Now on the injection well, it seems the management of those is slightly different or is different than from the solid waste, hazardous waste. What kind of oversight does the state have in terms of injection wells?
We don't regulate the injection wells under our division. They're regulated under the oil, gas, and minerals division. And they're also regulated very heavily by US EPA. US EPA is the main regulator for the underground injection wells for this type of material. So, and I'm guessing our folks over in oil, gas, and minerals division would be happy to kind of walk you through what happens there. But I know enough to be dangerous in that regard. But there is, I know there is a lot of, there's testing that has to be done. There's site evaluations that are done.
We're
the same
talking
as
about
the trucks.
dangerous stuff
Right.
here.
Right.
So, okay, that's pretty much handled by EPA, the injection wells.
Right.
Because I took note, there was an AP article a couple of days ago that, you know, it's a national article and they got into, you know, since the Ohio thing. And they were commenting in the article how there was an uproar all around the country because all of that stuff in Ohio did wind up in somebody's facility and nobody was notified because we've learned this is how. But they go on to say EPA finally issued a pointed statement after they talked about all the uproar in different places around the country. EPA finally issued a pointed reminder that states cannot interfere with federally authorized waste transport. And I believe this is covered under the Interstate Commerce Clause in the Constitution. So did we get a little shot from the EPA on that? Did we get that memo that was referred to in the article?
All the states, every state got that memo, just as a reminder. I mean, we understand that because the initial case that decided that was actually a solid waste case based on Michigan. We had our folks had to go to the US Supreme Court and we were trying to keep waste out from we were trying to keep out of state waste out, and the landfill facility sued us and said, you can't do that. And
right.
Supreme Court made the decision that waste is a commodity, it has value. And so, yes, it's protected under commerce law.
The famous Canadian trash fight.
Yes.
Which I think there's still people in Michigan that think, yeah, Canadian trash has been banned, but it never changed. It never slowed down because the Commerce Clause. Of the funding of these facilities, is there such thing as tipping fees for hazardous waste?
Tipping fees are charged by the facilities to their customers. We have what we call surcharges, and you want to speak to?
Sure. The way the funding is set up is there are surcharges based on the disposal method. The facilities collect that fee on behalf of the state and then submit it to the state. Those funds are directed into what's called an environmental protection fund and utilized as appropriated by the Michigan legislature. So there are, you sometimes do hear tipping fees. We call them surcharges. It's tomato in terms of how you refer to it.
It makes much more sense to have the two names in the solid waste program because we have a surcharge in the solid waste program, but the solid waste landfills have a tipping fee, and that's what they charge their communities, their residents, their commercial facilities. So the surcharge is the only thing that we have any part of in terms of being able to use those funds. And of course, those are set through the legislature.
So there is a fee between the company doing the dumping and the company receiving the dumping, and that's how they fund that. And
Right.
the state adds a little surcharge that then goes into a fund that the legislature, under the guidelines of that fund, can allocate those dollars.
Right, right.
Okay, yeah, I was wondering how that worked. I have a few other questions, but I think it's for some other people that are going to be addressing us today. Thank you very much, Ms. Brown, et al., and Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Colleen. Commissioner Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome to both of you and appreciate you being here. Touch on something that was just mentioned a few minutes ago about fees that are assessed, or I guess surcharges, if you want to call them that. My understanding is when that the state did increase those surcharges, or whether it was increasing surcharges or tipping fees, requiring those to be increased a number of years back, and it did slow down some of the solid waste that's coming in, but I may be wrong with that. But I'm wondering why we can't do the same thing. I know it would have to be legislative action probably to do the same thing with the hazardous liquid waste that are coming in. Is it your opinion that the state could do that?
The state could through the legislature. That's not something we can't say.
Right.
If you raise it, they won't come. So yeah, it has to be a legislative action. And we did try to get the solid waste surcharge raised a number of years ago from 12 cents to 25 cents. And that did not happen. We just amended the solid waste statute. They just became effective on March 29th. And it appears that we raised the surcharge, but what happened was it used to be 12 cents per cubic yard of material that was disposed, but most landfills do not use cubic yards, they use tons. So we changed it to tons, but there's about 3 cubic yards of residential waste per ton. So we raised, so it's now 36 cents a ton, but it's the same amount coming in. It's just that we changed what we were applying it to. So there is I think the biggest difference between, the potential for an impact by raising the surcharge in the solid waste program could be more successful than in the hazardous waste program in terms of being a deterrent, because to be honest, our hazardous waste facilities, like the Wayne Disposal Landfill, you don't have a landfill of that quality very often in the country. So the hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facilities are much more specialized than your local sanitary landfill. And so the options are more limited. And I won't say it wouldn't have any impact, but I don't know that it would have a significant impact to the amount of waste coming in terms of the hazardous waste program.
So you're saying, it sounded as though you were saying that because the waste coming in, the solid waste coming in, were measured differently than by different facilities, that the law did not have the desired effect.
Well, it wasn't easy to keep track, and it was causing facilities to have to do conversions, and different facilities were doing the conversions differently. So we said, well, you bring it in, you weigh it by ton, you don't measure it by cubic yards. Most of them have scales. They weigh the truck coming in, they weigh the truck going out, so they know the tonnage. And so we said, we're going to apply the surcharge to the tonnage, not the cubic yards. Again, in the solid waste program. That was the change that was made.
I assume you have a complete list of all the sites, the hazardous waste sites, as well as the just the solid waste sites in the state. Maybe we can is that available on the website of Vivo?
Yes, it is. Yes, we have a site with all of our TSDs. I don't know if there's a map associated with it. There is a map. There is an interactive map on our webpage for the hazardous waste TSDs, as well as our solid waste landfills.
As far as violations, is that also on there? Because I know after this most recent incident with the liquid hazardous waste coming in to Romulus, that there was some concern that there were violations at that facility in the past that
Right.
had not been followed through with.
Well, the violations are still what we call open. They haven't been closed. The facility actually addressed the violations very quickly, and they have not recurred again. The problem is because of the nature of the violation, there was no release of any material associated with the violations. They were more administrative violations, but because there were enough of them and they had occurred more than once, they were identified through our contract or our memorandum of understanding with US EPA. We had to consider them a significant non-complier. That's a term of art in that program. And if someone is a significant non-complier, we have to assess them a penalty because, they did bad things more than once. And so there has to be a cost to their business for that. So the only thing that needs to be done is to sign off on, for the facility actually has the draft order that we have to use to assess the penalty. And it's my understanding that they're getting the approvals to sign off on that, and they will pay the penalty. And once they do that, we can close those old violations. So again, the violations were very quickly addressed. We have not seen them recurring since that time. And the only thing left is to get the signed order and the penalty check from the facility to close those out, and then they will be closed out. But we have what we call our waste data system, and you can access, the public can access that, and you can search for a facility and you can get information on their compliance status, their license status, if they're a licensed facility, anything that we regulate in the hazardous and solid waste programs is available. That information is available through our waste data system.
Through your department,
Yes.
correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can, I mean, it's publicly accessible. We can send you, I'm going to send a copy of the PowerPoint that we shared, and we'll send you information on where to go on our website to find the facility lists, and then also how to access WIDS. And we can send information on the e-manifest system as well. That's manifest system is managed by the US EPA, but they also have a public facing part of it. But again, though there's a 90-day lag between the time that the manifest is entered into that system and the public can see it. But you could go back and get a history of what had happened up to 3 months prior for any of the facilities.
I was just
Those
gonna,
non-compliant, I'm sorry, did she have something else to say?
something occurred to me, and we kind of jumped to the next issue. That interactive map will show you all licensed TSDFs in Michigan. Those are both private and public. So just be aware of that. Private means that they handle only their own waste, whereas a commercial facility such as Wayne Disposal or Republic takes waste from other companies.
So MSU has a treatment storage facility or a storage facility on campus. So it's going to show up on the map, but I live down the road. I can't go there and bring my hazardous waste from my garage to them. They only deal with Michigan State University waste, just as one example.
Yep.
Last question I have is the non-compliance citations that a facility might receive for non-compliance of whatever rules they're supposed to apply to them. How many times are those progressive penalties, or are those the same thing over repeatedly as long as they address those non-compliance issues?
Well, there doesn't necessarily have to be a penalty if we find violations, depending on what they are, depending on how they're addressed. There may not be an order and a penalty associated with that. They get, again, assuming that there hasn't been a release, there has, it isn't something that we think is going to be a human health or environmental risk short term. One of the things is they have to label their drums, and if they don't put the date on the drum, if that was a violation that was found and that was about the only thing that was found, we would write that up as a violation, they would correct it, and then we'd close that out. We wouldn't assess a penalty for that. So, but if a facility, our old deputy director used to call it stuck on stupid. If a facility just, is not getting into compliance, is continuing to have issues, and we've done, an order with a penalty and there's still issues, the order itself has ongoing penalty built right in it. So it'll say, you have until June 1st to take care of this. If you don't take care of it by June 1st, then here's an additional penalty that will be assessed because of that. Or if they finally fix what's in the order and we close it out, and then, we go back 3 months later and stuff's all back to where it was before, then that's going to be, yes, that's something where we're going to be looking at they're either recalcitrant or they don't have the properly trained staff, whatever the case may be. Yeah, that's going to up their penalty for the next time.
Last question I have is whether or not there's ever been any of these sites that you have on your list that are ones that you monitor that have been shut down or suspended their business for violations.
Back about 30 years ago, I'm cringing because I was there, we did take away the license for one of our hazardous waste landfills. It was on the west side of the state, and they actually removed all the waste and closed out that facility. I'm not aware of any that we've shut down.
Not permanently shut down.
Yeah, that's the only one I know of that we've actually we took away their authorization to manage hazardous waste. But right, it's not an impossible process, but it is a phased process. So if they, most of them, if you have to get to the point where you give them an order, they pay the penalty, and they, keep running appropriately from then on. To be honest, in this day and age, again, like with our waste data systems, a generator can look up Wayne Disposal and say, oh, I'm thinking about using them for, a landfill. And they can look it up and they'll say, oh, they haven't had any violations for years and years. They must be okay. I'm going to go to them. Whereas if they look up somebody else and say, oh, they have continuing problems, I don't want to get messed up with that kind of situation. So it's to their benefit, to their bottom line to be compliant, because number one, the public, the community in which they reside, and then also their potential clients. And even I know more so in the solid waste program, if there's some companies, some of the major waste disposal companies, if a landfill gets a violation notice from us, it actually impacts the main operator's paycheck at the end of the year if they get violation notices. So there's a lot of reasons, and also just being good citizens, being responsible operators. There's all sorts of reasons for them to maintain compliance. But
Thank
we
you very
also
much.
understand. Yeah, we also understand it's a very complex program with a lot of moving parts, a lot of things that have to be done. And once in a while, a date doesn't get on a label, or a label falls off that somebody doesn't notice right away. So, you're always going to potentially find some things going on.
That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Anderson. Commissioner Marecki.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. I just have one question. Do the local municipalities or townships that host these type of facilities get a fee back to them?
Now, in most instances, if there's any kind of interaction, but it's between the facility and the locality. I know Wayne Disposal has a history of supporting their community in terms of, different things. Most of our solid waste facilities have what we call host community agreements, where they provide funding or different things, a police car or a school bus, whatever. But those are between the facility and the community.
Okay, thank you. That's my only question. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Marecki. So we have a couple of guest speakers that will talk briefly either on treatment or disposal or storage. And we'll start with Professor Schreck with Wayne State.
Thank you. Yes, Nick Schreck, and thank you, Madam Chair, for the invitation. I'm actually with Detroit Mercy Law, just a few blocks down Larned, and I teach environmental law. And most pertinent to today's discussion, I direct our environmental law clinic. And our clinic supported an investigation done a few years ago by the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center, which led to a Title VI civil rights complaint about the permitting of the expansion of the U.S. Ecology North facility, which is also a hazardous waste treatment and facility. And so a lot of the information that I'm going to share today, it was included in that Title VI civil rights complaint. And so I did want to acknowledge the great work of Nick Leonard at Great Lakes Environmental Law Center and attorney Alice Jennings, civil rights attorney here in town, who did a lot of this great investigative work that I'm going to share. And this is just to provide a bit of context on top of the regulatory system that the representatives from Eagle described. I just want to share some of the kind of context about the surrounding communities and what the impacts are to folks here in Wayne County. So a little bit of background on hazardous waste in Michigan. 65% of the people that live within 3 miles of hazardous waste facilities in Michigan are people of color, and that's despite being less than 25% of the overall population. Again, 65% of the people that live within 3 miles of these facilities are people of color here in Michigan. As of 2017, 70% of the waste that was sent to Michigan facilities came from out of state. So this is, very pertinent to the discussion about the East Palestine, Ohio train waste coming here. 25% of the waste came from another county within Michigan. So that would mean like if there's a facility here in Wayne County, they would be also importing waste from, Oakland County or Berrien County or wherever. Only 5% of the waste that comes to these treatment facilities is actually generated in the same county in which it's disposed. So if you're Wayne County and you have these disposal facilities, you're importing waste, whether it's from other states or other counties within the state of Michigan. There's 8 hazardous waste facilities in Michigan that are permitted to accept offsite waste. And this gets to the discussion we just had with Eagle, where there's many facilities that'll, kind of collect and capture their waste there and treat it at their facility. But as far as commercial facilities that are collecting and importing waste, there are 8 of those permitted in Michigan, and 6 of those 8 are here in Wayne County. I should also note that of those 8 facilities in the state, 7 are in communities where people of color within a 3-mile radius are above the statewide average. And 5 of those facilities are also located in communities that are above average low income residents as well. So low income people of color, you're much more likely to live next to one of these facilities in the state of Michigan. And just the Republic facility in Romulus, surrounding community, 46% of the people in the surrounding community are classified as low income, and 40% minority status according to the U.S. Census within a 3-mile radius of the Republic facility in Romulus. Also important to note, many of these sites are also located in communities where the surrounding population has lower English language proficiency than the statewide average. Certainly that's the case with the U.S. Ecology North facility here in Detroit, but in Romulus, for instance, the community surrounding the Republic facility, the limited English proficiency density is 77 score within 3 miles, and that is elevated. And I should just note that here in Wayne County, we have the largest limited English proficiency communities in the state, and we're about 4,000% the state average. So we have where there are communities with lower English proficiency, they're here in Wayne County. And again, higher percentage of folks living in those communities also live next to hazardous waste treatment and disposal facilities. Okay, and just a couple more things. So most of these facilities in Michigan, they do import waste for disposal. In 2017, there was over 222,000 tons of hazardous waste that was imported to Michigan from other states, and that's the equivalent of about 3 of these Guardian buildings, that we'd be importing in terms of hazardous waste every year. Don't check me on that math. That's a really rough estimate, but 222,000 tons. It's a lot of waste coming in. And of note, Ohio is the state that actually sends the most hazardous waste to Michigan. Again, as of 2017 numbers, they sent 77,000 tons of hazardous waste into the state of Michigan. And Wayne County, again, it's about 17.5% of the state's population, but is the destination for 94% of the offsite hazardous waste from other states. So again, here in Wayne County, certainly importing an outsized amount of this waste. I'm not going to go through all the permitting requirements. I think Eagle did a really good job of that. But I just wanted to know, in addition to those current violations that were discussed at their public facility, by my count, there were 24 other violation notices from this facility through 2020. So it has been a history of some compliance issues there at the facility. And yes, many of them are record keeping type of issues, but as I tell my students all the time, when we're talking about hazardous waste, record keeping is incredibly important. The way that we prevent uncontrolled hazardous waste sites from being developed, or the way that we prevent unscrupulous bad actors from being involved in this game, is by having very strict record keeping requirements and making sure that all the T's are crossed and I's are dotted, so that we can hold people accountable when accidents do occur. And I just, as far as moving forward, I mean, a lot of this regulation, as has been mentioned, this comes from our federal law, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, and then that authority being delegated to the state of Michigan to implement and to run this solid and hazardous waste program. There is some language that I think does give an opening for the state to take a more environmentally protective and public health protected approach to our permitting, and that's sort of the general public health, safety, and welfare. We have within our Michigan laws, the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act. We do have these clauses that say, it is the paramount concern of the state to protect our public health and to ensure that we're protecting our natural resources for us today and for future generations, and the public trust in those natural resources. And so Eagle is authorized to require an applicant for a hazardous waste facility to accept permit terms and conditions to make sure that we are protecting human health and the environment. Or if those permit terms might be inadequate, Eagle can deny that license application. So, certainly moving forward, I think we need to have a more aggressive approach towards permitting and licensing, because I'm sure, as Rhonda will testify in a moment, once these facilities are permitted, it is difficult to shut them down, right? They basically have a license to continue operating, again, assuming that they're operating in compliance with the law and responding to any violations that they may have. And further, I wanted to say that these facilities, they have to be operated in a manner that will prevent exposure of humans to the harmful quantities of hazardous waste or hazardous waste constituents, and preventing the pollution, impairment, or destruction of our natural resources in the state. And so this language that we have in state law does give some additional tools for the state of Michigan. Certainly it's the easiest for the legislature to act, as has been said, whether it's to raise fees, but there's some existing law that we have there where we could put some additional requirements on these facilities to ensure that we're protecting the environment and public health. And I'm happy to take more questions. Rather than kind of reading through some of these statutes, which might not be the most useful way to spend our time here this afternoon. So I think I'll end there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for your input and presentation. But before we take questions, we'll move to Ms. Rhonda Anderson with the Sierra Club to give a few comments and words.
And first, I just want to say thank you so much for inviting me here, Madam Chair and commissioners. So Nick has told you a lot about the work that he does. So I would look to Nick for data, for information, statistics, impact information. Once I can get some of that information, I worked with impacted communities. Nick has already told you most of those communities are Black and Brown communities. And those are the communities that I've been working with over the past 23 years. Now, when it comes to issues around waste, solid waste or liquid waste, some of my experience is limited, especially around liquid waste, but I do have some experience working on a campaign called CanFlow. This was a company that ran in Canada, but they brought their liquid toxic waste to the city of Detroit and discharged it there, okay? They were permitted by the city of Detroit, not by the state. So it became very difficult in assisting the community because of who regulated it, who permitted it. But this company wreaked havoc in this very small community on the east side of Detroit. Because once that toxic liquid waste, and it wasn't so much a flowing waste, it was thick, okay? That waste was discharged through the Detroit sewer system, okay? And then it backed up into residents' basements. That gave almost constant impact with this hazardous waste. So there was skin contact, air contact, okay? So this caused health impacts. So, and so let me just step back right here to say how critically important what you're doing today is. Because we're talking about health impact on volatile communities. So this is what I've heard here today from the state is probably the most I've heard in all of the years that I've been working on issues like this. So another area that I was involved in was a train derailment in the city of Detroit. Now, this was back in the early 2000s, but there was a 9-car train derailment and 3 of the cars were carrying chemicals. After the derailment, there was a 1-mile radius evacuation around the derailment. In that 1-mile radius, there was 1 high school and 2 or 3 public elementary schools. So can you see the seriousness of these situations with train derailments, okay? What we eventually did was simply go door to door, asking people if they had any skin irritation, eye irritations, because that's usually the signs of the impact, immediate impact. You don't know what the long-term impact. And that's another situation that we need to think about is long-term impact, long-term health impacts, because it's going to come out to be things like cancer, cardiovascular disease, asthma. And we already know that asthma is the highest in Wayne County than any other area in the state of Michigan. So we talked about Ms. Brown from Eagle talked about that these companies self-monitor. Yeah, you know, which isn't unusual at all. Actually, Marathon self-monitors, or most of these companies self-monitor. But I would question their results. Ms. Brown also said something about if they're monitoring that Eagle might come out and monitor too, as well. It's been my experience that there needs to be some concern over the equipment that they're using. Sometimes if it's handheld equipment, there might be some other type of equipment that is going to give you a much better detail of what you're monitoring for. I was also wondering if this hazardous waste that was coming from Ohio, if it was pre-treated. Did we hear anything about that? So because of the waste that was coming in from Canada and discharged through the sewer systems, it was supposed to have been pre-treated, but it wasn't. There were also guidelines and restrictions on when this material could be discharged. It shouldn't have been discharged after 5 p.m. and it shouldn't have been discharged on the weekends. We learned that it was being discharged on the weekend and it was being discharged at after 5. So I think some monitoring and enforcement in any of the things that we're talking about and discussing here today is going to be critical. But again, I commend you, commissioners, Madam Chair, I commend you for having this hearing because I think we've all learned a great deal.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. And that is really why we're having this hearing today, to get to the facts, and then we can see where we go from here, and we will continue to dig into this. And next we will have Mr. Pat Cullen. He's with our Environmental Services Division Director for Wayne County.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I first want to acknowledge and thank Liz Brown and our colleagues at Eagle for providing the information that they did this afternoon. Eagle works, they really do work very hard to protect public health and to protect the environment here in Wayne County at these facilities. They are vastly under-resourced to do the work that they're charged to do under state law. And that's something that we want to work towards assisting in any way that we can as well. I want to preface my comments by saying this. These facilities are really important to have. It's important that there are hazardous waste storage and disposal facilities in existence. We want and we need places where these, especially the most toxic and corrosive and reactive and flammable materials, can be safely disposed and treated at. Now, having said that, as Mr. Schreck mentioned earlier today, we seem to have a preponderance number of these in Wayne County. He had mentioned the 2 facilities in Van Buren Township. Well, there's actually 2 facilities in Van Buren Township. In addition to the Wayne Disposal Landfill, which is the only commercial hazardous waste landfill in the state of Michigan, and the only hazardous waste landfill in EPA Region 5, which is generally the Midwest states that's authorized to accept PCB waste. There is the Michigan Disposal Waste Treatment Facility on that same property, which is the largest hazardous waste stabilization and treatment facility in North America. That gives you a little idea of why we're such an attractive location for out of region, out of state hazardous waste to come here. In addition to those 2 facilities, you have the 2 facilities in Romulus that we've spoken about. And just a real quick note about the injection well. The thing about the injection well is for liquid hazardous waste that goes to the injection well, it doesn't have to get treated before it gets injected underground. So it's actually a pretty cost-effective, attractive location for liquid hazardous waste to go because it doesn't have to go through many of these expensive processes that require to get treated ahead of time. In addition to those two facilities, you have the two U.S. ecology facilities in Detroit that were also mentioned that are in communities that are frankly overburdened by a lot of different health concerns in communities that are facing a lot of challenges on a public health front. There were some interesting, one of the things I wanted to point out that I find very ironic in the way that we manage hazardous waste versus regular solid waste is under Part 115, which is the State Solid Waste Management Act, recently amended, as Ms. Brown had mentioned, it allows local counties to develop a plan, a solid waste management plan. And we have one in Wayne County, and we have an ordinance in Wayne County that directly regulates solid waste. And we have a regulatory staff in Wayne County that inspects our landfills or transfer stations or processing facilities. We do our landfills on a weekly basis, not on a quarterly basis. We inspect our transfer stations on a monthly basis, not on a quarterly basis. We have far more oversight and input, both at the county and the local level, on the least hazardous materials that get disposed, as opposed to the most hazardous materials that get disposed. So state law specifically states in Part 111 that a local ordinance, permit requirement, or other requirement cannot prohibit the construction of a hazardous waste treatment, storage, or disposal facility. It does also say there is one line in Part 111 that says the impact on the municipality where the proposed treatment, storage, or disposal facility is to be located in terms of health, safety, cost, and consistency with local planning and existing development, including proximity to housing, schools, and public facilities, has to be considered. It's the only thing in Part 111 that really takes into account local concerns, but it doesn't give any authority to a county or a local municipality to enforce those concerns. The state evaluates that through the permitting process, and we don't really have a say-so at the local level in what comes out of that. One more thing I wanted to mention about the transportation. They had mentioned the state has a Hazardous Material Transportation Act as well that says the act preempts and supersedes hazardous materials transportation registration or permitting programs administered by any city, village, township, county, or other political subdivision of the state. So local units of government are completely excluded from the regulation of hazardous waste. And, you know, just as a general concern for public health and environmental protection, it's an anomaly. And I think there's opportunities in state and federal law to bridge that gap somehow that allows locals a better say-so in how these facilities are sited and how these facilities come to operate. For solid waste facilities, as many of you know, in Wayne County, the county has a siting committee. We take into the concerns of the local residents and the communities when any time one of these facilities a new facility is built or constructed. We have no similar say-so when it comes to the construction or the operation of a hazardous waste facility. Let's see, there's a couple more things. One of the things that the state does every year for solid waste is they issue a report, an annual report that shows how much volume of solid waste gets disposed in our landfills, where it comes from. It's very clear and concise, and you get a really good idea. As a member of public, you can go to the state's website and find this report very easily. There is no counterpart to hazardous waste. Yes, it gets manifested. Yes, it gets tested. But there isn't real good transparency for a general member of the public to see how much material came into this facility in Detroit. What sort of volume and what types of materials are being disposed there? That information is really kind of hidden in a way. It's tracked, but it's not easy for the public to access. And we'd love to see improvement on that front. And just a last reminder for everybody in the room, everyone in this room has hazardous materials in their home. They have hazardous waste in your own home. Your fertilizers, your pesticides, your paints. some of the materials in those are the same materials that are getting treated at these facilities, just in smaller volumes. And so I would remind everyone that we do have a household hazardous waste program in Wayne County. We do try to assist residents in the proper disposal of those materials. We hold 4 large-scale collection events every year, and we have a voucher program where any resident in the county can get a voucher from our office and dispose of those materials at our contractor's facility in Livonia. And just as a note for Detroit residents also have free household hazardous waste disposal available to them too. So before we go on really criticizing the commercial and industrial users of how they're treating these materials, it's important that we're taking care of our own business as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very informative, all of your presentations. We really appreciate you being here today. I think Commissioner Marecki, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And I just have one question for Nick. You gave the statistics when you started out about these facilities being in areas of people of color and low income and English differences. Do you know how many of those facilities were there before a neighborhood was built around and vice versa? Was a neighborhood there and then they brought in the facilities?
That's a good. Sorry, am I on now? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I can't say about each of the 8. I will say, like, for instance, the facility in Romulus, it was, I think, early 2000s when it was initially licensed, so 2005. I know there's been expansion of some of the facilities within the city of Detroit over time. Like I mentioned, the US Ecology North facility that just expanded their operations here a few years ago. And you know, one thing I didn't mention in my comments is that I do think often there's a sense of, oh, well, maybe, you know, people moved in or moved around these facilities. But we have to remember that within the lifespan of many facilities that were at least generating hazardous waste, you know, certain people couldn't live in these neighborhoods because of redlining, right? Like there were neighborhoods that were completely closed off to African-American families, and they had to live in certain areas, many of which were closer to hazardous waste generating facilities. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the demographics have shifted over time, but what we have not seen is a shift away from these facilities being located in low-income communities of color, and that's, you know, goes back to 1970s, 1980s, of the early environmental justice movement days, where one of the first key touch points of environmental justice was a hazardous waste facility being planned in Warren County, North Carolina, and exact same issues like I raised here today. You know, low-income community of color saying, you know, we've had enough, we don't want more of this waste. And so it is, you know, sadly not a unique issue to Michigan, but it's something that I think, you know, we have to, you know, continue to question, you know, why these facilities are located where they are, and how we can, you know, hopefully process our waste in a more equitable way going forward. So yeah, sorry, I don't have it like facility by facility, but I did have a couple examples there of where some of these facilities have expanded their operations over time. Some are more, you know, newly permitted, and at least in the 2000s.
And what kind of restrictions are there? This could be to any of you. Like, I represent, part of my district is Northville Township, and right across their border, they've got a huge landfill there that was there before the houses came, but they were told that facility would be eventually closed and they'd use it for something else. And they want to now go across the street and extend their facility. So are there any restrictions to that, or do they pretty much get to do that if they already have the facility? Does anyone know?
And I think Liz is still on the line. Maybe that's a question for her.
You know, yeah, she still is on the line.
Yes.
Oh, Pat does.
There you go.
Yeah, you're speaking about the Arbor Hills facility?
Yes.
Yes. If they wish to expand, I believe that their additional acreage is already identified in the Washtenaw County plan. And if that's the case, then as long as their construction permit meets the requirements, then we would After our review, we would have to approve it again, assuming it meets the requirements and they make any changes that are needed to be made. They would get approval because we don't have any other option. You know, if somebody applies and they meet the requirements, we would have to approve it.
And do you have any kind of public hearing for that? I
We
mean,
would-
it sounds like it doesn't really matter, but
Well, you know, and that's a frustration I have, is that, yes, there will be a public hearing and a public comment period and all of that associated, assuming we get a construction permit application for the facility. But again, as we spoke earlier, in terms of the hazardous waste program, the same is true with the solid waste program, that lack of interest by the locals, while potentially understood, is not a reason to deny the permit or, you know, an ongoing license. It has to be a technical issue where the facility does not meet the requirements in the law.
okay, thank you. That's all I had.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Vice Chair Commissioner Colleen.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to everybody for coming today. As any good hearing, this raises probably more questions than it answers. And I'm hoping after this, Madam Chair, that we can establish some sort of a working group between the commission and the executive branch to talk about some of these issues that are being raised, to talk about what Wayne County might want to do with regards to, but we've got some thorny legal issues to work through that we're not going to through today. Mr. Cullen, on the question from Commissioner Marecki on the expansion, we went through this a few years ago with the expansion of the solid waste, not hazardous waste, landfill down by Crosswinds March. And if I recall at the time, that is the only landfill in the county that county government has any say-so, like over the expansion of it. No other landfill, that's all controlled by the state.
So it's a little bit opposite of that.
Uh-oh.
Our solid waste management plan has in it a siting process that includes a siting committee, where anyone who wants to construct a new or expanded solid waste facility, which would be in a landfill, transfer station, or processing facility, has to come to us with an application, and they go through a process that's identified in our plan for approval. The unique thing about Wayne County's process, well, there's a couple of unique things about Wayne County's process. Number one, it requires a host community agreement, which means as a basic tenet of whatever they do, they have to have an agreement, and it's usually a pretty beneficial one to the local community with whoever their host community is. It also allows, however, for significant input from neighboring communities. That's what you don't see, Commissioner Marecki, in the Arbor Hills case. Because Arbor Hills is in Washtenaw County and it's on the county line. They have their own plan. They have their own process. It's different than ours. I will mention though, and Liz Brown had mentioned how Part 115 had recently been revised, and part of the new amendments allows for the new planning committees to allow for a member of a neighboring community to be on the planning committee. So I think there's some hope on at least on the Washtenaw County side, that there will be a representative from Northville Township there to express their concerns. But there isn't a similar process for that facility like there is in Wayne County. Now, the Carlton Farms landfill is a little unique, Commissioner, because this is going back some time. 35 years ago, the county sued the original owners of that facility because they wanted to expand without our authority. The county entered into a settlement agreement with the company at the time that basically outlined the area that we would authorize as being included in our county's plan. So they can't get outside of their footprint now without, going through the process. But they've been allowed to, expand without further, a committee review. We've had recent expansion requests, one in Van Buren Township from Waste Management at the Woodland Meadows landfill, which was authorized in 2018. And then the city of Riverview recently has been going through the process and our citing committee rejected their application just last year.
Okay, now we'll go back to the hazardous. Do we know of the hazardous facilities, either solid or the injection wells? First of all, the capacity of those, how many gallons or how many tons or however it's measured, cubic yards, because when we permit, from what I know of, like household, those facilities have a capacity to them. And we can say there's still 7 years of capacity or something like that. Is that true for hazardous? Do we know how full the facilities are, the hazardous facilities in Wayne County, and how much more life there is? No, do we know as Wayne County?
As Wayne County, we do not.
Ms. Brown, if I may, from Eagle, do you have information as to how much, for lack of a better term, life there is to the hazardous facilities in Wayne County? So we know how much longer waste will be coming here?
We have about 30 years of capacity at the Wayne disposal landfill. Now, for the treatment and storage facilities, they have limits in terms of how much they can have on site at any one time. And it's, some of it may be in tanks, some of it may be in containers, but their lifespan is as long as they choose to continue their business and they continue it in an appropriate manner. So, but the landfill has about 30 years of capacity based on their current fill trends and the space they have left yet to develop.
Let me make sure I understand that, Ms. Brown, one more time. Is it the landfill was built with 30 years of capacity, or we estimate today there's still another 30 years in which they can accept hazardous waste?
There's still another 30 years.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I guess I'm going to ask Mr. Schreck, and I've got my last question on this. Mr. Cullen was pretty strong in saying that these hazardous waste facilities are a step forward and that we have to have them. Can you briefly describe what the heck was going on with all this hexachlorine and all of the really ugly stuff before we had this federal legislation? What was happening to that material?
Yeah, great question. And I certainly agree that it is better to have closely regulated, permitted facilities where when they do, if ever step out of line, we can bring enforcement actions. Definitely a better scenario than what we had prior to the RCRA law being passed, and certainly also prior to our other federal environmental statutes like Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. All those laws actually work in concert with each other. When we grab pollution out of the stack at a smokestack at a factory and capture it in a scrubber, that waste has to be disposed of somewhere, likely going to a hazardous waste landfill or some other facility. Similar with water pollution, right? When we pull it out of a pipe before it gets discharged into the Detroit River, that waste has to go somewhere. And depending on the characteristics of that waste, that will determine whether it's hazardous or conventional and where it gets disposed of. So yeah, I share all of that it's much better to have these facilities, have them licensed, have them permitted, having them operated under a regulatory umbrella. And I'll answer the rest of your question in a second, but I do have to also acknowledge that doesn't necessarily make you feel better if you live next door to one of these facilities, right? We have to acknowledge that it is better certainly from a regional and a state perspective to have this waste collected and treated, but it doesn't change the fact that if you live next door, you live across the street, that you're not going to have these concerns. So prior to our federal environmental laws, many of our so-called Superfund sites, the sites that are these orphan sites where there is not a responsible party that we can go after to pay for the cleanup expenses, many of those occurred prior to these federal environmental laws being passed. And so we are still today dealing with the toxic legacy of pollutants, going back to Arsenal of Democracy days in World War II and previous to that. There's contamination left over. As soon as we started to industrialize, we had pollution that has accumulated. And so frankly, it was a lot of dumping, open dumping, the theory of dilution is a solution to pollution. You take it out in the water, dump it in Lake Erie, and it'll go away. Well, fortunately, now we know a lot better, but we're still dealing with a lot of that contamination through today. People are getting sick through today because of these legacy pollutants that are out there. And so, yes, it's better to capture it, to make sure that it's controlled, to make sure that it's treated and disposed of in a licensed facility. I guess while I've got my soapbox for a second, I would say, getting away from these chemicals is really where we need to go. And I know this is sort of like motherhood and apple pie, but really, as long as we're continuing to, use these products and to create things that take, hazardous chemicals to be created, we're going to have to deal with that waste. And so that's just, again, something we have to consider. And then the other thing is that if it's not being disposed of here, it likely will go somewhere else. Rhonda and I we were chatting a little bit about the pet coke on the Detroit River before the hearing today, reminiscing a little, and if you can call it that. And the solution here, when we got it off the Detroit River, a lot of it went to Toledo, and then it gets shipped on. So it's not always a solution to just say not here. But again, these are the challenges that I think we face. And so it is better to have this stuff regulated. We're in a much better place than we were, pre-1970s with controlling this waste. But that doesn't solve the problem of, again, people living in the community next door to these facilities. That doesn't give you comfort to say, oh, in general, we're much better off than we were prior to these laws being passed.
Yeah, and I envision that, like before there was federal legislation that companies, big, small, or whatever, have their 55-gallon drums full of nasty, ugly stuff. And they're like, oh, just go throw it in the creek in the back of the property, and that's how we'll get rid of it. And so I agree it's a step forward, but I think this underscores, Madam Chair, and it's come up here today, the role of oversight in government and strong oversight in these matters. So again, I'll suggest hopefully between the commission and the administration, we can go into some of the issues that were raised today. Mr. Cullen talked about some of the possibilities under the current law, as did Mr. Schreck, of perhaps things that local communities could do. So I'm hoping we have a little work group in the county that really goes deeper into these issues and can come out with some recommendations, oversight, either things we can do or that the legislature needs to do. We need to have these sites, but as was said, they have to be closely regulated. And I think given what we hear today, there's not close enough regulations. And I think all of our regulators that are here today would say, yes, give me more tools. So thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you, Madam Chair, for arranging this today.
And thank you, Commissioner Colleen. You took a lead on this and invited many of our guests. So I really appreciate your support in helping pull this together. And thank you, all of our guest speakers. And of course, Ms. Brown from Eagle, thank you so much for your presentation. This is a longer meeting than usual, but I think it was a very important one, and we will continue the work. We will continue to work. Any commissioners have any other questions? No? Well, thank you so much, and we will definitely be in contact with you. Thank you again.
Thank you. Take care.
Right. So we're going to move forward with our agenda, and Madam Clerk will move to the next item.
Item 2, forwarding the medical examiner's office turnaround time analysis from December 2022 to February 2023.
Is there a motion, receive and file this item? Yep. All right, it's been moved and supported. Those in, please vote on this item. Okay, and we can take.
Commissioner Anderson?
Yes. Oh,
Commissioner Anderson?
Commissioner Anderson, can you vote? Yep, no problem.
Motion carried.
Let's see, we can take the next couple of items together. So if you can move to the number 4. Let's see.
On item number 3.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, 3.
Item 3, requesting commission approval of a grant award with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Health Resources and Services Administration Health Center Program.
Any questions on this item? All right, next item, please.
Item 4, requesting commission approval of a grant agreement with the State of Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs.
This is our marijuana education campaign. Any questions? All right, next item.
Item 5, requesting commission approval of Amendment 7 to a 5-year professional services contract with a 1-year option to renew with Assured Family Services.
This is our CMOs. Any questions on? Right, we'll take the next item. Another CMO.
Item 6, requesting commission approval of Amendment 5 to a 2-year contract with three 1-year options to renew with Black Family Development.
Any questions on this item? All right, we can move to the next item, another CMO.
Item 7, requesting commission approval of Amendment 5 to a 2-year contract with 3 1-year options to renew with Bridgeway Services.
Discussion, questions? All right, next item, please.
Item 8, requesting commission approval of Amendment 5 to a 2-year contract with 3 1-year options to renew with CCMO Center for Youth and Families.
Next item.
Item 9, requesting commission approval of Amendment 5 to a 2-year contract with 3 1-year options to renew with GrowthWorks.
Discussion. Next item.
Item 10, requesting commission approval of Amendment 5 to a 2-year contract with 3 1-year options to renew with Insight Youth and Family Connections.
Discussion. Next item.
Item 11, revision of resolution number 2022-412, approving a 2-year comparable source contract with 3 1-year options to renew with Spectrum Juvenile Services.
I didn't know if I could do that and the motion one's still up. Oh, it does work. Okay. Thank you,
Vice
Madam
Chair
Chair.
Curley, go ahead.
On this item, because this plays directly into our juvenile and our JDF and the whole situation. Now, some of the discussion has been that we have had way too many people in the JDF because of a lack of placement options outside of the JDF for youth. And I know there's a lot of talk in Lansing about expanding that. But I see this is one that we're doing with our general fund dollars and matching to the child care fund. So could we discuss how many beds this is going to add? And are there other things in the pipeline in Lansing that you know? Because I don't believe this is going to cover what we really need in the county. So if you could talk about the numbers a little bit, what this does, and then other efforts that are going on out, perhaps up in Lansing to, because this is reopening a facility that was closed, right?
Dr. Abdul El Sayed, HHVS Director. So to answer the question, this makes us more competitive for beds that already exist. And one of the challenges that we have is not just that there are not enough statewide beds, it's that for the beds that are available, it's a supply and demand question. And are we able to pay a similar rate for or against others who may also occupy the bed? So we are one of 83 counties, plus some of these beds will take out-of-state residents. And so the state of Michigan just raised their rate. And while the state can place on behalf of all of us, we uniquely place Wayne County residents. And so we want to be, in effect, first in line for the beds that already exist with Spectrum. Beyond that, though, to answer the broader thrust of the question, the state has been a really great partner for us in trying to open up more beds. So one of the things that they are doing is working with Spectrum to open up 40 more beds. And what we'd like to do is have a rate high enough such that the higher proportion of those beds come to us. They recognize, of course, that whereas there are 83 counties, the acuity of the challenge is worse here than any other county. And so they've been very good about supporting us on that front. But the numbers have to make sense for the provider. And so given that the state raised their rate, we'd like to raise our rate to their rate plus 3% so that we are offering the best rate and can move our placements up.
The state rate that is being raised, is that to discourage people from other states coming here?
I can't speak specifically to that and the intention behind what the state did, but what I can tell you is that one of the challenges is keeping and maintaining or starting and maintaining placements. From an economic standpoint, financial standpoint, there has just been a relative underfunding of these beds. And so raising that rate increases the probability that other private providers might want to get into the business. And I think from that end, functionally, it has the benefit of increasing the probability that there will be more beds.
Well, let's certainly hope so, because, I hate to talk about it this way, right? It's just like jail cells, right? The bidding contests from different counties. Yeah, we offer a cheaper rate. Send your prisoners up to us if you need room in a jail. So I hate talking about these things in that sense, but hopefully these pressures will benefit. How many additional beds do you think we need? This is 40, correct? Above and beyond that, what do we estimate we need for Wayne County?
Cecily Hoagland, Administrator in the Juvenile Youth Service Division. This is for 50 beds.
50. But that doesn't solve our ultimate problem. How many total more beds do you think we need in the county?
So as of last week, we had about 69 adjudicated youth in our facility. So some of those youth are back in after violating each other, but several of them have never been placed. And so, the overall estimate for the state, that is a broader question. But for us, it would be safe to say that we'd need overall placements for an additional 69 kids. The thing I will say is that we've been working with a partner to put together a residential day treatment program to try and augment, and the courts have been fantastic partners for us on that as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, and I think to that point, with the increase, it will open up opportunities for more providers. So I understand the reasoning behind that. All right, well, I think we covered actually 11. I'm sorry. Commissioner Marecki had a question.
Yeah, I have
sorry.
a question for you guys. Thank you. The state has just announced that they're going to redo the Hawthorne Center and the other center that's next to it in Northville Township. This, of course, is not going to happen tomorrow, but will that be a facility that we're going to be able to use for the kids? I just heard it peripherally, so I don't know all the details, but is that something to look forward to?
It is definitely something that'll benefit the county for sure. And it would benefit our operation at the JDF because there at any given time are a number of youth who need long-term psychiatric care. And because there are not beds available, they stay at the JDF. And Getting placements is, as we talked about, a matter of supply and demand. We need more supply, and getting that bed that hospital up and running will really certainly benefit toward that end.
Okay, good, because I mean, that's been there forever and it looks old as, I'm glad they're doing something with it. So maybe they'll even be building more in there. I don't know, but okay, thank you.
Lean, I think he had.
Madam Chair, I wasn't going to raise it today because they're mental health beds, what they're doing out there, which are also desperately needed. And I don't know if you know, Mr. Director, off the top of your head, the way I read it, this is going to be no additional mental health beds. They're going to move beds from other facilities to there. So the 200 beds they're talking about, I don't think they're additional beds. Do you know?
So speaking to the dynamics of inpatient mental health care, my read is that one of the challenges is while we know we need more inpatient psychiatric facilities, the state of healthcare makes sustaining them very difficult. And so if the state were to step in and say, we are going to secure these beds, even if they're moving from elsewhere, those are beds that may have shut down in a time when we need more inpatient psychiatric care. That's my read of it, and I'm inferring a bit from the dynamics of what has happened for inpatient mental health.
Potentially, if the state didn't step in here, they might have closed the other beds. And I'll just comment, Madam Chair, that what you might refer to, well, we're in the age of integrated health now, but back in the day, we would talk about medical beds and mental health beds, and medical beds generate more revenue. And in the state, hospital systems are obligated to a certain extent to provide a certain number of mental health beds. But my experience over at the Mental Health Authority is that they kind of routinely ignore that. And it's like, hey, you're supposed to have 18 beds out here. Well, we only got 12 or something like that. So yeah, getting access. So this should stabilize at least the number of beds.
To your point, if you have a limited number of spaces in a hospital executives will almost always choose to make those spaces yield as much money for the hospital as possible. And mental health patients don't yield much money. And so to your point, right, even if the macro incentive is that we need more mental health beds, the micro incentive within any given hospital is to shut those beds down to make room for ICUs, et cetera, that make more money. And so the state jumping in is in effect a state subsidy for the mental health system, saying that we recognize that this is not a high yield proposal, and that the state, to address the public good of mental health care, will step in and address that.
And I'll just comment, Madam Chair, we are talking largely about nonprofit facilities here, looking at profit bottom line when it comes to mental health. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next item, please.
Item 12, requesting commission approval of Amendment 1 to a 2-year comparable source contract with 3 one-year options to renew with Spectrum Juvenile Justice Services.
Discussion. I think we just talked about it. Next item. Oh, actually, I think that's it, right?
Yes.
All right. Is there a motion for items 3 through 12 for approval?
Stephen,
We voted on that.
we did?
one. Yep. we
Okay,
voted.
that's my motion, 3 through 12 for approval.
All right. And it's been supported. All those in favor can vote. Motion passed. Next item.
F, such other matters as may be properly submitted before the committee.
There are no such other matters. Next item.
Public comments.
All right. Is there anyone from the public, either in the audience or on Zoom, on the phone, in any emails?
There are no emails.
Anyone in Zoom? And no one here? All right. Next item, please.
Adjournment.
There a motion? It's been moved and supported. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.